Separate Ways DLC for Resident Evil 4 Remake released yesterday, and for me personally, I loved it. The story, the gameplay, just about everything that you liked about the original, you would probably like even more in this version of the game. And now that I've completed the DLC for my first playthrough, I figured now is the perfect time to talk about the best changes to Separate Ways compared to the original version. I'm looking at things that were added, the change in the lore, and even the improvement of specific characters. So my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and this is my top 7 best changes we see in Resident Evil 4 Remake's Separate Ways. Also, obviously this video will include spoilers for Separate Ways, so please don't watch this video until you play that first and then come back and check this one out. Don't worry, I'm not gonna go anywhere. I'll still be here when you get back. But with that out of the way, let's jump straight into it. Ada Wong is pretty much the James Bond of Resident Evil. She's the spy character that has all the pretty cool gadgets. Her most notable gadget in Resident Evil 4, of course though, is the grapple gun. The biggest difference this time around is that Ada is able to use the grapple gun in combat. She's able to travel long distances to perform a melee attack, as well as she's able to remove shields from enemies as long as you have the right keychain equipped to your case, of course. It doesn't add a ton to the game, but it adds a unique new feeling to her combat versus Leon's combat. Not to mention, Ada will also be able to reach higher areas of the game and even make a quick getaway whenever she needs to. This is something that was sort of featured in the original version, but it's explored so much more here in this version, especially during combat like the one that you get with one of the bosses in the game. I won't go too much into it because I might actually talk about it a little bit later on this list. But there's also another tool useful for Ada in the Separate Ways DLC that was not in the original version, and that is Iris. Iris is basically contact lens with the ability to track footprints and fingerprints. For example, we use this tool to solve a puzzle by following a path to figure out a researcher's favorite artifacts in order to open a lock. Another example includes multiple segments of looking at keypads using this tool to see the buttons pressed the most in order to reveal the password. If that doesn't seem like Mission Impossible shit, I don't know what else does.
Well, that was excessive.
So I guess I want to start this off by saying that there aren't a ton of new locations in this DLC. Exactly what you probably expected, a lot of it is reused assets from the main game. However, there are a few unique locations brought into this DLC that was not in the main game and not in the original DLC either. For example, we see both the laser room and the gondolas make their return in this DLC because obviously they were not in the remake, but they were in the original game. The laser room's really cool because you actually get to see a really cool encounter with Ada and this beast that we'll talk about a little bit later on.
Always have an out.
And the gondolas, well, they were the gondolas. Nothing really special about them. As a matter of fact, they were probably on the same level as they were in the original game. We also get to see other areas that we didn't see in the main story of Resident Evil 4. Stuff like the waterway and the comms facility. Actually, the comms facility features a new boss that I mentioned earlier, and it is also where you find that laser room that I mentioned earlier. And of course, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this topic, there are a lot of reused assets, but you get different perspectives from them. So yes, you get new areas that makes it feel a little bit more fresh, and you also get a new perspective of very familiar areas. And that was already much more than I expected, so I really enjoyed that.
This is Leon's jacket.
What you buying? Well done, stranger.
So something that completely blew me away was that Resident Evil 4 Remake decided to include a new feature, side quests, or also known as merchant requests. While the original game did include specific areas that allowed the player to shoot medallions, the remake of Resident Evil added so many more things on top of those side quests. You still shoot medallions, but first off, there's a lot more areas to those medallions. But then there's also other objectives that you can complete, including looking for specific items, or my personal favorite, the fact that you come face to face with some stronger variations of enemies you've encountered throughout the game. Now, despite this surprise, I didn't expect that the release of the DLC will also include these side quests in Ada's campaign as well. Yet, I was pleasantly surprised again. Overall, it wasn't a game-changing mechanic, which is how I felt about the inclusion of this in the main game, but it is something that adds a little more playtime to a very exciting DLC. Luis is a character that wasn't really explored as much in the original Resident Evil 4. Don't get me wrong, the guy was charming and fun and entertaining to watch in the original game. However, it was the remake that really defined him as an interesting character with a conflicted backstory. In the main game, we see Luis interact a lot more with Leon and Ashley compared to his original appearance. And we even see Luis save Leon's life from Krauser before he passes away. Not to mention his backstory has improved with Capcom now adding his connection to Umbrella. However, we get even more of Luis's personality and character in separate ways.
No! Sorry, what kind of a man leaves a lady?
We see the charming attitude of his as he flirts with Ada a few times, and how he's a good person that did bad things. He's wanting to risk his life, literally running into a fire, in order to help save not only Ashley and Leon, but Ada as well.
No, no, no! We can't let the medicine be destroyed!
Luis, let it go. Luis.
Actually, we even see Luis give up the opportunity to escape with Ada at one point in order to help save Ashley and Leon, despite how risky this is. Overall, it's a solid improvement for Luis's character, and separate ways help kind of build upon what was already kind of started with the original main game.
Okay, Luis. What was it that you said again? You should have known by now, Wesker. I don't always play by your rules.
I guess I gotta start with the elephant in the room, and that is the fact that I am not a huge fan of the new voice actress for Ada. Now, I definitely don't agree with people out there harassing her and blaming her for Capcom's decision, but I do have to speak the truth here when I say I'm just not a fan. Of course, I also grew up with the original version, so it's hard for me to imagine her differently than what we got in those versions. Now, with that being said, as far as Ada's character goes, I felt like it was a massive improvement. In the original Separate Ways, we pretty much don't get much character development for Ada. She still acts like she has no remorse about any of the things she has done, and comes off as a typical mercenary that has feelings for Leon. However, we get to explore Ada much more as a character in this version. We get to see how the events of Raccoon City are affecting her, how she's slowly starting to change who she is because of the things that went down there, and her connection to Leon now. It was actually really fun to see this side of her. It's not something I expected to see when it comes to Ada Wong. Like, you actually get to see her fighting with herself and battling with her inner demons as to if she wants to follow her heart and be a better person, or if she wants to keep up that mercenary-like attitude and just stay in it for the job. From a character perspective, this was one of my favorite depictions of Ada throughout the series, actually. I do feel like the voice acting isn't right for me yet, and maybe that'll change over time. I also feel like the dialogue feels a little weak and boring, but the character development is there, and it's definitely exciting to watch this build up throughout her Separate Ways campaign.
Oh, Ada. What to do with you?
So Albert Wesker is by far my favorite video game villain ever. The dude is simply a badass and is intimidating as hell every time he is on the screen. And the original Separate Ways did a great job at including him as a main part of the game without actually having him on screen. But without him being there in person, the intimidation factor wasn't as strong. Luckily, the remake's version of Separate Ways changes this completely. I'm not entirely sure how people are going to react to Wesker coming in person in this version of Separate Ways, but I love this change. Like I said earlier, Wesker is far more intimidating as a villain in the field than he is as a man in the chair. There are a few things about him being there in person that actually makes more sense than how the original game portrayed it anyways. Firstly, it explains how Wesker was able to retrieve Krauser's body so quickly. It's because he was already on the island. Also, we get to see more of how calculated he is in this version. Sure, he has no problem sending Ada to do his dirty work, but this is Wesker, a man that doesn't take any chances. The sample is vital to his plan for world domination, and he's not going to allow his plans to rely on the success of a mercenary with a conflicted resolve. So seeing him here makes more sense for his character. Wesker just has never trusted people, and the remake's version of Separate Ways handles this perfectly. What's more is that we even get more teases of Resident Evil 5 Remake, which is making me feel even more confident about Resident Evil 5 Remake being the next Resident Evil game to get a remake. Albert Wesker was by far my favorite part of the DLC in terms of the characters. Albert Wesker was by far one of my favorite parts of the DLC. Seeing him become more of the villain that I've always pictured him as has made me even more excited for the prospect of him being the main villain in Resident Evil 5 Remake. Bring it on, Capcom.
Clingy type. Time to end this for good.
So first, I gotta warn you that I have a lot to say here, so prepare yourself. In the original version of Separate Ways, the boss fights included stuff like Krauser 2.0, Saddler 1.0, and even the giant troll itself. However, Remake's Separate Ways goes far beyond this in my opinion. Starting off with the fact that we get a Verdugo throughout the game with multiple fights against it. For example, we see Ada face off against it at the start of the game, and again in the village. Its ability to create hallucinations that can attack you and cost you precious ammo created a unique boss fight that was not in either the original game or even the remake's main game. We see this explored more with the transformation of the Verdugo into U3, which of course is a boss fight in the main game for the original Resident Evil 4. However, this time, instead of the obstacle course with a time limit, we instead get a new phase of the fight. Separate Ways also made the combat area a little smaller, making it slightly more difficult here than it was in the original game. However, the big change is the second phase. Whereas Leon's fight ends after his official face-to-face encounter with this form, Ada's fight adds a new phase that focuses on the parasite portion of the creature. It pulls itself off the body and becomes a centipede-like monster that Ada must finish off. I'll admit, this phase is not extremely difficult except for the Navistadors flying around, but it's a new phase of the fight that I definitely wasn't expecting. One surprisingly missing boss from the original Separate Ways though was Mendez. Considering that in the main game we see Ada shoot him and then he chases after her, it was a shock to see that there wasn't a small boss fight or a sequence between the two in the original game. Luckily, the remake's version changes this with the addition of Mendez as a brief stalker enemy during a small section of the village area. Yeah, I know, it's short, but it's something new that we didn't get to experience with the original version. We also get new versions of specific enemies that were in the main game. For example, the giant troll monsters, well, you get to come face to face with one as Ada. Now, this was in the original Separate Ways DLC, however, it has a new feeling to it. This time, the battlefield allows you to kind of traverse onto different rooftops as you're battling against this thing, while also fighting against the horde of enemies around you. Even Saddler has improved, even though in the original it was pretty much just his human form just walking towards you for the most part. Now let's take a look at a new boss that was added to the Separate Ways DLC. This time it was actually a giant hunter-like creature, sort of, although I have to admit it was a little less exciting than the rest of the bosses in the game, since pretty much it was just you running away from it. Still, all of these changes and the add-ons in terms of the bosses added so much more value to Separate Ways, to the point that I'm actually confused as to how this DLC was only $10. The only letdown I would say is the fact that we don't see a Krauser fight. But when you think about it, from the original version, that was literally just a copycat boss fight from Leon's campaign, and it wasn't really anything different or special anyways. For all of those reasons, this is hands down my favorite part of the new Separate Ways DLC for Resident Evil 4 Remake. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace. Hit up the comments and let me know if you guys prefer the original Separate Ways or the Remake's version. If you ask me, I think with this version being a little longer and having more character development for people like Luis, Wesker, and Ada, that this is the better version of Separate Ways. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more ranking videos like this one, as well as hitting that like button, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Also, if you want to become a Stars Patreon member and support the channel, the link is in the description below. But as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace. Take care.